When the universe needed monsters for battle, it turned to humanity. The ship did not announce itself. One moment the sky over Chicago was clear, pale blue, and full of ordinary clouds. The next moment there was something in it that had no business being there. No sound, no warning, just a shadow that swallowed 6 city blocks and kept spreading. I was standing on the roof of the UN liaison building when it appeared. Sergeant Major Lara Vasquez, 38 years old, 15 years in the Army, 4 combat deployments, and I had never once in my life felt small. Not in a jungle, not in a desert, not a mountain pass at night, but standing on that roof looking up at the underside of something that made our tallest skyscrapers look like pencils. I felt small for the first time. The radio on my hip went insane. Every channel at once, military frequency, civilian emergency broadcast, police dispatch, weather radio, all of them screaming over each other. I turned the volume down and kept staring up. The ship was not beautiful. That is the thing people get wrong in movies. Alien ships in films are always sleek, graceful, full of curves and light. This thing looked like a continent someone had picked up and hung in the air. It was dark gray and covered in structures that made no visual sense. Towers that pointed inward, rings that spun at wrong angles, surfaces that looked like they were made of stone but moved like liquid. My commanding officer, General Carter Voss, came through on my earpiece. His voice was steady, which told me he was terrified, because Carter Voss was only steady when he was terrified. Vasquez, roof, stay there, do not go inside. Already on the roof, sir. Good, keep your eyes on it. Hard to look anywhere else, sir. The ship stayed still for 4 hours. Nothing happened. The whole world held its breath. Air traffic was grounded. Globally, within 40 minutes, every military in the world went to its highest alert. The United States, Russia, China, the European Union, all had assets pointing at the sky within 2 hours. Not that it would have mattered. Looking at that ship, you understood instinctively that anything we pointed at it would have been less threatening than a thrown pebble. Then a smaller craft descended from the underside of the ship. Not small in any normal sense. It was roughly the size of a city stadium, but compared to the thing it came from, it looked like a lifeboat. It landed in Lake Michigan without making a splash. The water simply moved out of the way. I was on a military helicopter heading to the lakefront within 6 minutes. The first thing I noticed was the sound. The smaller craft hummed at a frequency just below hearing. You felt it in your back teeth and the base of your skull. It was not aggressive. It was not welcoming. It was completely indifferent to how you felt about it. A door opened in the side of the craft. Light came out, but it was not warm light. It was the color of winter sky just before snow, cold and flat and ancient. They walked out in a group of 7. They were tall, 2 and 1 2 meters at least. Some of them, their bodies were vaguely humanoid, but the proportions were wrong in ways that took a moment to identify. Limbs slightly too long, heads slightly too large, fingers that bent in directions fingers did not bend. Their skin, if you could call it that, was translucent at the edges and darkened toward the center of their bodies, like looking into deep water. At the front of the group was the one I would come to know as Invoice Sable. Sable was made of something like crystal, not literally, I would later learn, but the outer membrane of its Kind grew in lattice structures that caught and fractured light. When it moved, it sent small prismatic flickers across everything nearby. Its voice, when it spoke, was not a voice at all. It was a chord, multiple tones, simultaneously, like a small orchestra, had been compressed into one throat. The translation device it carried rendered its words in flat, accented English. The accent sounded like someone who had learned the language from a textbook written by someone who had also only read a textbook. We request the entity designated as the human species representative. Secretary General Amara Ose stepped forward. She was 61 years old, from Ghana, and she had more composure in her left hand than most people had in their entire bodies. She looked up at Sable without flinching. I am the representative. I am Amara Ose. Sable studied her for 3 seconds, then it said something that changed the course of human history, and it said it the way you might ask someone to pass the salt. We require your warriors. We are losing a war. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Secretary General Osai said, "Tell us about the war." That conversation lasted 9 hours. I was in the room for all of it, standing against the wall, watching, listening, making notes in a battered green notebook I had carried since my first deployment. Old habit: when things get confusing, write them down, make them real and manageable on paper. What Sable told us was this: the Galactic Conclave was not one species, it was a coalition of 61 civilizations, the youngest of which had been spacefaring for 4,000 years. They shared technology, governance, structures, and a common philosophy of conflict, which was built around precision, minimal force, and rational calculation. They had been at peace, more or less, for the majority of recorded conclave history. Then the Vreth arrived. The Vreth were not one creature and not many creatures. They were a hive mind, a single consciousness distributed across trillions of individual bodies spread through the cosmos. They did not want territory in any way a rational species would understand. They did not want resources or power or survival in the conventional sense. They consumed star systems, went dark as they passed through them. Planets went cold, not because the Vreth destroyed things out of malice, but because consumption was simply what they did, the way a river does not intend to flood a field. The Conclave had been fighting the Vreth for 312 years. They were losing. Not quickly, not catastrophically in any single moment, but slowly, measurably, with the terrible patience of mathematics. Every year they held fewer systems than the year before. Every year the Vreth adapted more precisely to conclave battle tactics. The Conclave fought with logic, and the Vreth had 3 centuries to learn that logic. Why us? Secretary General Osa asked. You have 61 civilizations. You have technology we cannot imagine. Why come to Earth? Sable was quiet for a moment. Its crystalline structure shifted slightly, the prismatic light settling into cooler tones. Because your species is unlike any we have studied, it said. You are classified as a Tier 1 feral species. Primitive technically, but our observers have watched your world for 200 years. You fight differently. You fight in ways we cannot model or predict. Your wars are not rational. Your warriors do not behave according to calculable parameters. Sable paused. We have tried everything rational. We Require something else. I wrote in my notebook at that moment. I wrote, they are desperate and they think we are wild animals who might be useful. I underlined the word desperate twice. Os, I said, we will consider your request. Sable said, we expected deliberation to require many days. Os, I said, we will have an answer in the morning. I went home that night to my apartment. I sat at my kitchen table and ate leftover rice and stared at the wall. Outside my window, the city was not rioting, not panicking, not in chaos. Mostly people had gone to their rooftops and their balconies, and they were looking at the sky where the great dark shape of the conclave ship was still visible, blotting out a quarter of the visible night sky. There was a woman on the balcony across from mine. She was maybe 60 years old, with a cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders. She looked up at the ship for a long time, then she went back inside, and I heard very faintly the sound of her television. The world goes on. That is what humans do. The world goes on. In the morning, Secretary General Os met with Sable and said, yes. The aliens did not applaud. They did not express gratitude. Sable simply nodded once and said the assessment team would arrive within 72 hours to evaluate potential combatants. I watched its crystalline face for any sign of relief or hope or even simple professional satisfaction. There was nothing, just that flat, cold light. As I walked back to the vehicle, I thought about what it would feel like to be so desperate that you called on a species you clearly considered beneath. You called on them not as equals, not as allies, but as a last resort, a tool you did not fully trust but had no choice but to use. I wrote one more thing in my notebook before I got into the car. I wrote, they are afraid of losing, and now they are going to be afraid of us too. I did not know yet how right that would turn out to be. The assessment station arrived in Earth orbit 3 days later, quiet as a held breath. It was not as large as the main conclave vessel. Nothing was as large as the main conclave vessel, but it was substantial enough that the astronomers who spotted it first briefly thought a new moon had appeared. It sat in a stable orbit 200 km above the surface, a dull gray mass the shape of a flattened disk, and for 2 days it simply watched us with sensors we could not see and could not block. On the 3rd day, I was on a shuttle heading up to meet it, 40 people with me. Colonel Raymond Oakes in the seat to my left, reading a physical newspaper he had somehow found, folded neatly the way people used to fold them before everything went digital. On my right, Dr. Petra Holly's the lead xenopsychologist assigned to the mission, who had spent the last 72 hours barely sleeping and consuming what I estimated was approximately 4 L of coffee per day. How are you feeling? She asked me as we cleared the atmosphere. Like I'm delivering livestock to an auction, I said. She laughed, which surprised me. Then she looked out the window at the station, growing larger above us. That's probably closer to accurate than either of us would like, she said. The docking process was smooth in the way only extremely advanced technology can be smooth. There was no bump, no shudder, no noise. The shuttle simply stopped moving, and a corridor extended to meet us, and we walked through it into an environment that immediately made everyone a little uneasy. The station was designed for conclave physiology. The ceilings were 3 m high. The lighting was dim by human standards, and slightly blue-shifted, giving everything the quality of late evening. Underwater, the corridors were wide but curved in ways that did not align with human intuition about where a hallway should go. You could walk a straight line and somehow end up facing a different direction than you expected. Sable met us at the docking bay. Beside it were two other conclave members I had not seen before. One was shorter and denser looking, with a body like dark-packed clay that shifted slightly as it breathed, as if things were moving beneath the surface. This one, I would learn, was Assessor Lorne. The other was almost invisible. I do not mean that as a figure of speech. Its outline was difficult to hold in focus, as though the eye kept sliding off it. This was Scholar Venice, who was present to observe and document, and who would, over the following days, become what I can only describe as obsessively fascinated with every single human in the building. We were brought to an assessment hall. It was large and white and smelled of nothing neutral, controlled, the kind of space that had been designed to produce no sensory input that might influence results. Waiting, there were 460 volunteers. They had been selected from a global pool of 9,000 applicants who had responded within 24 hours of the UN's quiet public announcement. The selection criteria were deliberately broad: active military, retired military, emergency services, search and rescue, a mining engineer from Australia named Frank Doyle, who had once survived being trapped underground for 11 days and had reportedly spent the time reorganizing his rescue plan rather than panicking. A pediatric surgeon from Lagos named Dr. Nkecha Demi, who had spent 6 years working in an active conflict zone and who, when interviewed, had said simply, "I have seen enough suffering. Show me where to stand to stop more of it." There was also a man named Pete Calloway, who had listed his occupation as retired fisherman, and who I later learned had been a Navy combat rescue diver for 22 years before retiring. He had showed up to the testing site in paint-stained work pants and a jacket with a logo on it from a bowling alley. The Conclave assessment program was, I gathered, the same program they used for all potential combat species. It had been developed over millennia and was, they assured us, comprehensive and reliable. The first section was physical tolerance testing. Assessor Lorne operated the equipment. Subjects were placed in a chamber that gradually increased atmospheric pressure, temperature, and a form of directed energy that Lorne explained stimulated the neurological pain response without causing actual tissue damage. The expected response across all conclave species was withdrawal at a consistent threshold. The test was designed to identify that threshold. 40 minutes later, Lorne approached Sable with an expression that, on a human face, would have been confused disbelief. "The instruments require recalibration," it said. "The instruments do not require recalibration," Sable said. "The readings are outside design parameters. Then the parameters require expansion." I was watching from the observation gallery above. Dr. Hollies was beside me, making rapid notes. I leaned toward her. "What's happening?" "They designed the pain threshold test to measure up to what they consider extreme," she said quietly. "The ceiling of the test is what their toughest species can endure, apparently. Several of our people have already gone past it and are asking what comes next. Below us, Pete Calloway was sitting, the testing chamber, reading a small, paperback novel he had produced from somewhere. He had been in there for 47 minutes. Lorne kept checking the instruments. Calloway turned a page. The second section was what the conclave called rational retreat assessment. It measured through a series of tactical simulations the point at which a combatant would identify a situation as unwinnable and execute strategic withdrawal. This was considered an essential survival skill. Every conclave species had a clear, predictable retreat threshold, knowing that threshold let commanders plan. The humans had no threshold, not in the way the test was designed to measure. The simulation scenarios escalated in difficulty until they reached conditions that were, by any objective calculation, entirely hopeless. Most conclave species began retreat protocols between 60 and 70% probability of mission failure. Their most decorated warriors might hold to 80%. Human volunteers held to 98, some held to what the system calculated as 100. When asked afterward why they had not retreated, the answers were not tactically sophisticated. They were things like because we hadn't tried everything yet, and because giving up felt worse than losing. And from the retired fisherman who had apparently also been assessed as having the highest raw physical tolerance of anyone in the group, quitting is a habit. I never started it. Lorne pulled Sable aside. I could not hear the conversation, but I watched Sable's crystalline surface flicker rapidly, the prismatic colors cycling in a way I had started to read tentatively as agitation. Then came the psychological battery. This was the one I had been most curious about because Dr. Hollies had spent the most time worrying about it. Conclave's psychological model for effective warriors required a specific emotional profile, controlled, calm, detached. They wanted combatants who could make optimal decisions without emotional interference. They tested for emotional stability under stress. They tested for fear response. They tested for aggression modulation. 40 minutes into the psychological battery, Venice, who had been silent and semi-transparent in the corner of the observation room, drifted to my side and spoke to me through its translation device. We have not encountered this before, it said. What specifically? I asked. Your people are afraid, it said. Many of them. The instruments detect the biochemical signatures clearly, elevated stress hormones, rapid cardiac response, the physical markers of fear. Yes, I said. And yet they are not behaving as afraid creatures behave. I looked down at the assessment floor. Frank Doyle, the mining engineer, was in the middle of a high-stress simulation that involved a collapsing structure and no visible exit. The simulation was designed to trigger maximum fear response. Frank Doyle was, as far as I could see, arguing with the simulation system, pointing at a section of the virtual ceiling and explaining to it in detail why the structural collapse was proceeding in the wrong order. We are afraid, I said to Venice. We just do things anyway. Venice was quiet for a moment. That is not a trait we have encountered in a sapient species before, it said. The fourth day of assessment introduced a new element: group testing. Cooperative scenarios. Here, for the first time, the conclave assessors saw something that generated what I can only describe as a visible crisis in there. Composure. Human volunteers who had never met before were working together within minutes, not just functionally working together the way any pack-minded species might coordinate, but laughing together, making each other more effective through what appeared to the conclave observers to be completely irrelevant social behavior. The scenario was a simulated combat evacuation. A wounded team member had to be extracted under pressure. The conclave's model predicted that non-bonded individuals, strangers to each other, would cooperate at 40% efficiency versus a bonded unit. The human strangers cooperated at 91% efficiency, and they made jokes the entire time. Lorne's clay-like surface had been shifting increasingly rapidly for 2 days. On the 4th day, it stopped Sable in a corridor that I happened to be walking down and said something it clearly did not realize I could hear, because it did not think of me as someone worth privacy from. These creatures are not behaving like a Tier 1 species, Lorne said. No, said Sable. They are not even behaving like a warrior species. They are behaving like. Lorne paused. It seemed to be searching for a category that did not exist. There is no classification for this, it said. No, said Sable again. What do we do? Sable's crystal surface caught the blue-shifted station light and scattered it across the curved walls in a brief, cold spray of color. We use them, it said. I kept walking. I did not look back, but I wrote in my green notebook that night, sitting in my bunk in the human quarters, where the lights had been turned up warmer at my request, and someone had found a coffee maker and produced 12 cups of decent coffee from somewhere. I wrote, they came here thinking they were borrowing a tool. What they got was something that does not fit any of their categories. They do not know what to do with us. They are going to use us anyway, because they have no choice. I paused. Then I wrote, they should probably be more worried about that than they are. The formal assessment concluded on day 5. Sable informed Secretary General OSI via transmission that humanity's contribution had been deemed acceptable. It was the most reluctant compliment I had ever heard. The deployment briefing came 48 hours later. Target: a fractured moon called Keth Aval on the outer edge of a contested system 4.2 light-years from Earth. I looked at the star charts they provided us. I looked at the scale. I looked at the distance from everything I had ever known. Then I looked around the briefing room at the people who would be going. Dr. Adami was sharpening a pencil with a pocket knife and reading a medical text. Colonel Oakes had put down his newspaper and was listening with the careful attention of someone who intends to be ready. Pete Calloway was asleep in his chair, which either meant he was very calm or had learned that sleep was the best preparation for anything. I wrote one line in my notebook. I wrote, whatever is waiting for us out there has never met anything like us. That is either going to go very well or very badly. Then I closed the notebook, put it in my jacket pocket, and went to find more coffee. The briefing said rear support. That is what it said, written clearly on the official deployment order that Colonel Raymond Oakes had signed and initialed. At the bottom right corner, perimeter defense and logistical reinforcement. We were to stay behind the conclave's primary combat lines and make sure the supply route stayed clear. I read that order on the transport as we dropped out of faster-than-light travel. For the first time, which is an experience I cannot adequately describe, except to say that the universe seemed to pause for a single second and then resume playing as though a very old machine had briefly stuttered. Keth Avel was gray and broken-looking in the viewport, a moon that had been partially consumed by the Vreth, its surface cracked along lines that glowed faint orange from whatever heat still moved beneath. The largest fragment was the size of a small country. The conclave had a garrison there. Garrison that had been fighting, holding action for 8 months and was, according to the briefing, doing fine. They were not doing fine. We knew within 20 minutes of landing that the official report and the reality on the ground had very little to do with each other. The conclave garrison was 6,000 strong. They held a fortified perimeter around the largest population center on the fragment, a buried installation full of research equipment and approximately 12,000 conclave civilians of 3 different species. The garrison had started with 11,000. Their commanding officer, a tall being called Commander Velko, whose species had bodies like pale driftwood that moved with quiet precision, met Colonel Oakes at the landing zone. The translation came through our earpieces, clipped and formal. "You are the human contingent." "We are," Oakes said. "Your assignment is rear perimeter. The Vreth assault patterns have not reached the secondary defensive line. You should be largely inactive." "Understood," Oakes said. Velko's looked at him for a moment, studying, then it moved off with its officers, and Oakes turned to us and said quietly, "Right, let's go see what's actually happening." What was actually happening was this. The Vreth moved in waves, not like a military advance, not in any way that resembled tactical coordination in the conclave sense. They moved the way a tide moves, without urgency and without pause, and what was most frightening about them was not any individual unit, but the impression of infinite patience they gave. The Vreth did not care about losses. Losses were functionally meaningless to hive mind distributed across a galaxy. Each individual body was simply a cell in something vast and uncountable, and when cells died, more cells came. The conclave fought them with precision. Weapons, calculated fields of fire, optimal defensive formations that had been tested across centuries of warfare. When a Vreth wave came, the conclave responded with exactly calibrated force, repelled it, repositioned, and prepared for the next. The problem was the Vreth had been watching conclave tactics for 300 years. They had learned the calculations. They knew with enormous accuracy how much force would be needed to break any given conclave position, because they had broken thousands of them. They had learned to read the logic. The conclave's second line had held for 6 days when we arrived. The first line had held for 8 weeks before that. The third line behind us was where the civilians were. There was no fourth line. On our 11th minute at the rear perimeter, the second conclave line broke. I heard it before I saw it, a sound that I still cannot categorize. That was not an explosion, and not a scream, and not white noise, but something between all three, a sound that the Vreth made when they moved in numbers. It was the sound of things that had no individual voice, making a collective noise that had no precedent. The conclave's second line did not collapse in chaos. That was the thing. It retreated in perfect order, clean and disciplined and completely predetermined. They had calculated the retreat threshold, and when the probability reached the triggering point, they moved. No hesitation, no attempt to improvise a hold. They fell back to the third line in a formation that was almost beautiful in its precision. The breath flowed into the space they left between the retreating conclave forces and our position. There were now approximately 300 m of open ground, and an advancing breath waved at the sensors, estimated at 4,000 individual bodies. I looked at Colonel Oakes. He was not looking at me, he was looking at the wave. His jaw was set in a way that I recognized from 2 deployments. With him, a look that meant his brain had finished calculating and had arrived at a decision that the order said was wrong and his instincts said was the only option. He keyed his radio. "All units, this is Oakes. Forward now." His second in command, Captain Lewis Farron, said, "Sir, the order is perimeter. The rear perimeter no longer exists." "Lou," Oakes said, "all units move." There was a pause of perhaps half a second, then we moved. I want to be precise about what happened next because I was there and because I have read the conclave's after-action analyses, and they are, while accurate in their facts, completely wrong in their interpretation. The conclave analysis said that the human contingent executed an unplanned frontal engagement. This is technically true. It also describes a volcano as some hot rocks, which is technically accurate and completely misses the point. What happened was this. Raymond Oakes charged into a breath wave, 4,000 strong, with 812 human soldiers, 6 medical personnel, including Dr. Adami, one mining engineer who had apparently decided to stay with the unit and was carrying a section of support strut as a secondary weapon, and Pete Calloway, who had been asleep in a transport vehicle and who came out of it at a dead run when he heard the movement, still pulling on his equipment. The breath had a processing system, distributed intelligence that monitored all fronts simultaneously and made tactical adjustments in real time. When a conclave unit engaged them, the hive allocated a precise portion of its attention and resources to that engagement. The calculation was efficient. The calculation was the problem. The calculation was based on a model. The model said, identify the size of the opposing force, calculate its expected behavior based on species profile, allocate appropriate response, execute. The model did not have a species profile. For us, the first thing that disrupted the breath processing was the noise. Conclave forces were quiet when they engaged, coordinated, precise, without unnecessary vocalization. Human soldiers were not quiet. Human soldiers under adrenaline were producing a range of sounds that the breath had never encountered in combat, sharp, varied, non-repetitive sounds that the hive's pattern recognition system kept trying to categorize and could not. The second thing was the movement patterns. The breath had learned to read the geometry of conclave combat. They knew where a unit would be when it advanced, because conclave units moved in patterns optimized over centuries. Human movement did not look like that. Captain Farron took her squad through a flanking route that no tactical model would have selected because it was inefficient and exposed, and somehow worked anyway. A fire team led by Sergeant Kofi Mensah went directly into the densest part of the wave and then came out the other side, which the breath processing appears to have registered as anomalous approximately 4 times in 1 minute. The third thing was Frank Doyle. I do not have a clean tactical explanation for what Frank Doyle did. The mining engineer from Australia who had no military training, who had been allowed to accompany us for reasons that still sit in a file marked irregular attachment, picked up a piece of debris from the moon's cracked surface that was roughly the size and shape of a small bathtub, and he used it. I watched him do it. The breath in that section of the line appeared to experience the same processing delay that I experienced watching him, which is to say they stopped for a full second, and in a battle a second is a very long time. The breath wave did not break. I want to be clear about that. We did not destroy it. 800 people do not destroy 4,000 breath, which are not truly individuals anyway and cannot be counted the way you count soldiers. What we did was something that Venice, the conclave scholar who I would not know, was observing us from a remote sensor platform until much later described in its notes with a word from its language that translated only roughly into English. The translation the device gave was confusion so deep it becomes stillness. The breath wave slowed the hives processing, encountering inputs it could not model, allocated more attention then more in the way a computer runs hot when it encounters something it was not designed to process. And while the wave was slow, the conclave's third line, where the garrison had regrouped, realized what was happening and fired into the wave's exposed flank with everything they had. The wave broke. Not because of us alone, not because of the garrison alone, because of both, and because the breath, for the first time in 3 centuries of war, did not know what it was looking at and could not decide what to do about it. The ground went quiet, not peaceful. Quiet, the quiet of a very large thing catching its breath. Colonel Oakes stood in the middle of the open ground, dust on his uniform and a long cut across his cheek that he was not paying any attention to. And he looked at the position we had held, and then at the position the breath had retreated from, and then at the conclave garrison line. Commander Velkoz had come out to the forward position. It was standing 30 m from Oakes, and it was very still. The pale driftwood surface of its body was doing something I had not seen conclave physiology do before. It was shivering, very slightly, very finely, like something vibrating at high frequency. Velkoz said through the translation system, "You were assigned to the rear perimeter." Oakes looked at it. "The rear perimeter moved," he said. Velkoz was quiet for a very long time. Then it said, "Yes, I see that it did." I was writing in my notebook. I wrote, "We have been here for 11 minutes beyond the official deployment of rear perimeter support, and we have already altered the course of an engagement that has been static for 8 months." I paused. I added, "Oakes did not ask permission. Nobody did. We just moved." Then I looked up because Pete Calloway was standing nearby, and he had produced from somewhere in his equipment pack a small folded piece of paper that turned out to be a printed photograph of what I assumed was his family, and he was looking at it for a moment with an expression that was not fear and not quite peace and not quite sadness, but something made of all 3. Before he folded it back up and put it away and went to help Dr. Adami with The wounded. I watched him go and I thought, this is what the conclave cannot calculate, not the tactics, not the endurance, this. The fact that we carry our whole lives into every fight and we keep going. Anyway, I wrote that down too. Keth Avil held. That was the simple version of events. The conclave's official record would state that the garrison at Keth Avil held against a sustained breath offensive with the assistance of a human auxiliary unit, that the engagement was resolved after 14 hours of active combat, and that the moon fragment was successfully secured, allowing conclave researchers to extract 3 months of critical data on breath structural composition before evacuating the installation. The simple version left out a great deal. What the record did not say was that Commander Velkos filed a private communication to the Conclave High Council 40 minutes after the battle ended. I did not read this communication until 2 years later, when Venice showed it to me as part of what it called its documentation project. The communication said, among other things, that the human unit had behaved in ways that were not classifiable under any existing combat doctrine, that the effect on breath tactical processing appeared to be significantly beyond the effect of force applied, and that Velkos personally recommended an immediate review of the human engagement framework. The final line of the communication read, "These beings do not fight the way any thinking species fights, they fight the way a force of nature does. I do not have a category for them. I recommend we develop one before we commit them to a larger theater." The High Council's response was brief. It said that the human engagement framework would be reviewed at the next quarterly session. The next quarterly session was in 3 months. In those 3 months, humanity fought in 7 more engagements across 3-star systems, and I was present for most of them, my green notebook filling steadily with observations that no military academy had prepared me for. Venice was present for all of them. The scholar had by this point stopped trying to be subtle about its interest in us. It followed the human units the way a documentarian follows a subject at the edges of everything, sensor arrays running constantly, its nearly invisible body drifting from position to position. It asked me questions at every opportunity. Some were tactical, some were scientific. Some were the kind of questions you get from someone who has encountered something they cannot fit into their existing understanding of the universe and is genuinely deeply unsettled by this. Why do your people give names to objects? It asked me once after watching Sergeant Mensa introduce a new piece of equipment to his team by announcing the name he had given it and informing them that they would be treating it with respect because it makes them real. I said, when something has a name, it has an identity, it matters. Venice recorded this in conclave. Species, only living things of cognitive significance, receive designations. We give names to boats, I said. We give names to cars, mountains, cities, storms. Some people name their house. Plants. A pause. This is not rational. No, I said, it is human. What Venice was watching and what it was slowly, with enormous effort, beginning to understand was something that the conclave had no framework for. They had encountered hundreds of species. They had models for pack behavior, hive behavior, hierarchical societies, dispersed intelligence networks. They had models for courage, for stubbornness, for endurance. They did not have a model for what Dr. Ademi did on the fourth engagement. We were on a station above the gas giant, called Morival, a transit hub that the Vreth had decided was worth consuming. The station housed 40,000 conclave citizens. The Vreth came in numbers that the tactical systems rated as overwhelming. The conclave garrison began an orderly evacuation, prioritizing efficiently as their models recommended. The most valuable were to leave first: Research Personnel Council, representatives, cultural archives. The humans were assigned to facilitate the orderly process. 40 minutes in, Dr. Ademi found a section of the station that had been sealed by a damaged bulkhead, cutting off approximately 2,000 non-priority civilians, mostly agricultural workers, and maintenance staff that the conclave's evacuation priority system had placed at the bottom of the list. The system had given them a survival probability of 11%. Dr. Ademi looked at the sealed bulkhead. She looked at the structural readout. She looked at the 11% figure on her screen. Then she put her hand on the arm of the nearest conclave evacuation officer and said in a tone I recognized from watching her work, the tone of someone who has already decided and is informing you rather than consulting you. We need a cutter and 2 evacuation teams on this corridor immediately. The conclave officer said, those individuals have been assessed at low survivability probability. Resources are allocated to higher priority units. Then I am reprioritizing, she said. Cutter 2 teams now. The officer said, you do not have that authority. She looked at it. I am a doctor, she said. Patients have no priority ranking. Get me the cutter. Nobody moved for approximately 3 seconds. Then Colonel Oakes, who had heard the exchange, said 2 words into his radio that I will not put in my notebook because they were not appropriate for official records, and pointed at the bulkhead, and we cut through it in 11 minutes. The 2,000 workers were evacuated. Survival rate was 94%. Venice was in the corridor watching. Afterward it approached Dr. Ademi. It was quiet for a long moment, its translucent body shifting with something that looked increasingly, as I became able to read its body language, like distress. The probability model allocated those resources elsewhere, it said. I know, she said. Your action was not optimal according to the model. The model was wrong, she said simply. How do you know when a model is wrong? She looked at it directly. She was not angry. She was tired, her gloves still on, and she looked at this ancient alien scholar with the same expression she probably used on difficult patients. Patient and firm. When it tells you to leave someone behind, she said, the model is always wronged. Venice recorded this. It would quote it in every report it filed for the next 2 years. The 7th engagement was the one that changed the conversation at the conclave. High Council. It was a deep space engagement over a dying star system, and it was the first time the Vreth attempted a direct counter to human combat behavior. They had been watching us the way we had been watching them. The hives distributed intelligence had been processing human engagement data for 3 months, and it had developed a response. It came in overwhelming numbers. It targeted the human units specifically. It deployed Sensory disruption designed to overwhelm. Human neurology. For a full hour it worked. 60 human soldiers were out of the fight. Senses scrambled, communication systems were partially down, the position was crumbling, the conclave units on the flanks were already calculating retreat. I was on the ground for this one. My Snort's radio was producing noise. Instead of words, I could see maybe 6M. In any direction, the disruption field made the world look like it was. Flickering images breaking apart and reassembling a half-second out of sync with reality. Captain Louise Farron, who had lost her radio and 2 of her squad leads and whose left arm was in a makeshift brace from an impact 20 minutes earlier, gathered the soldiers who could still function and gave them the most direct tactical address I have ever heard in my life. She said, eyes up, move together. Whoever's next to you, you're responsible for them. That's it, let's go. No calculation, no probability assessment, no optimal resource allocation. She was responsible for the person next to her. That was the entirety of the strategy. The disruption field was not designed for what happened next, because what happened next was not a tactical response, it was not logical. A group of 60 soldiers, partially incapacitated, with degraded senses and broken communications, moved forward together into the worst of the field rather than away from it, because that was where the rest of their people were. The breath processing system spent 40 seconds trying to compute the response of a species that was not retreating from a field designed to drive retreat. 40 seconds in a tactical engagement is an enormous amount of time to give your opponents, the conclave flanks, seeing the breath hesitation, did not retreat. They held, then they advanced. After the battle, Venice was very quiet. For a long time, then it said to me in a tone that I had learned to read as the closest thing it had to awe, you move toward what hurts you. When your systems are failing, you move toward the center of the failure. Yes, I said. That is not survivable behavior by any model I have. No, I said. And yet you survived. Yes. Another long quiet. The breath will not be able to model this, Venice said. They have modeled everything. They have 3 centuries of data on every thinking species in this galaxy. They have no data on a species that moves toward disruption rather than away from it. I wrote in my notebook, we are not winning because we are powerful. We are winning because we are not what they expect. Then I wrote something that had been forming for weeks and that I finally put down in words. I wrote, the conclave came to us, thinking they were asking a primitive species for its teeth. They did not understand they were asking for something much stranger than that. They were asking for a species that does not do things because the numbers say to. That carries its people's photographs into combat, that names its equipment, that cuts through bulkheads because 11% is not 0%, that moves toward the thing that is trying to push it back. I wrote, Soval asked us for monsters. I do not think it understood that monsters is exactly what it got, not the kind that destroy without thinking, the kind that think and choose and still do the thing that looks from the outside like it cannot possibly work. And then I looked at Captain Farron, who was having her arm properly splinted by Dr. Ademi, and they were talking quietly. And at one point Farron said something that made Ademi laugh, and I thought, There it is, that is the thing though. Vreth cannot compute the laugh at the end. Soval found me the following morning. I had been half expecting it. It stood at the entrance of the human quarters which it never entered, and when I came out it said without preamble, the Vreth have issued a communication to the Conclave High Council. I waited. They have requested that human forces be withdrawn from all active theaters. I kept my face still. The Conclave declined, Soval said. Of course, I said. Saval's crystalline surface was still. No prismatic cycling, no color movement. The stillest I had ever seen it. Sergeant Major Vasquez, it said. Question. Go ahead. Do your people understand what they are? I thought about this for a long moment. I thought about Oaks charging forward on Keth Avel, about a demi at the bulkhead, about Farron moving toward the disruption field, about Pete Calloway with his photograph and his paperback novel. Not in the way you mean, I said. We do not think of ourselves as unusual. We are just doing what we do. That is perhaps the most alarming part, Soval said. It turned and walked away. I went back inside and wrote in my notebook, the Vreth are afraid of us. The Conclave is afraid of us. Everyone out here is afraid of us. I sat with that for a while. Then I wrote, good. The war ended on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because Colonel Oaks was complaining about the coffee. That morning, he had been complaining about the coffee every Tuesday morning for the 4 years. We had been deployed beyond Earth's solar system, and by that point it had become a kind of ritual, a reliable noise that meant things were normal. The coffee was bad, we were still here. Carry on. The communication came through at 7:14. Station time. Soval delivered it personally, which was unusual. Usually communications came through the standard relay. It said the Vreth hive mind has ceased active operations in all contested theaters, not retreating, not pulling back to regroup, ceased. The individual bodies had stopped moving. In some systems they had simply settled onto the nearest surface and stayed there, unresponsive, like machines that had been switched off. All Conclave monitoring systems confirmed it within 6 hours. The war was over. Nobody celebrated, not immediately, not in the way I had imagined growing up, watching old war films where the news arrives and everyone erupts into noise and relief and tears all at once. Instead, there was a very long quiet, the kind of quiet that follows something you have been braced against for so long that its absence feels like a physical sensation. You push against a door for years and then the door opens and you stumble forward because the resistance is gone. Soval stood in the communication center and looked at the data feeds for a long time. Then it said in its flat translated voice, the one that had no warmth in it and had never pretended to have warmth in it, it appears to be concluded. Oaks nodded once. He was still holding his coffee cup. He looked at it, seemed to register that the coffee was still bad, and set it down. Right, he said, what happens now? What happened now turned out to be complicated. The Conclave called a full council session within 72 hours. All 61 member civilizations sent representatives. It was the largest gathering of the Conclave in 400 years since the original coalition had been formed. The agenda was rebuilding, reconstruction of consumed systems, resettlement of displaced populations, the long and Painful work of counting what had been lost. Humanity was invited to attend, not as observers, as participants. I sat in the back of the council chamber, which was vast and carved, as far as I could tell, from a single piece of material that was neither stone nor metal, but something between the two. The chamber was designed to hold representatives of 61 species simultaneously, which meant the seating arrangements were architecturally remarkable. Platforms at different heights, different atmospheric pressures for different sections, translation feeds, running in dozens of simultaneous modes. Secretary General Oss sat in the human delegation section on the main floor, beside Colonel Oakes and Dr. Hollies. I sat in the row behind them. When the council chair, a being from a species I had not encountered before, whose body was the approximate shape of a large clenched hand and who communicated through patterns of bioluminescent light, recognized the human delegation, the chamber went noticeably quiet, not the polite quiet of diplomatic decorum, a different kind of quiet, the kind of quiet that falls when something very large and very still is paying close attention. Oz gave a short address. She thanked the conclave for the partnership. She expressed condolences for the losses across all member species. She said humanity was prepared to assist with reconstruction efforts in whatever capacity was needed. She did not mention what we had done in the war. She did not make claims. She spoke the way she always spoke, which was with the particular kind of authority that does not need to announce itself. When she sat down, the chamber stayed quiet for several seconds. Then the session continued, and humanity was officially integrated into the reconstruction planning process, and in that purely practical way, the species from the third planet of a minor star became part of the largest coalition in the galaxy's recorded history. It was not a triumphant moment, it was a bureaucratic one, full of scheduling, coordination, and resource allocation, discussions and translation, complications. But something had changed in that room, and you could feel it, not dramatically, not with fanfare, but solidly, the way a door that has been locked for a long time finally stands open. After the session, Sable met me in a corridor outside the main chamber. This had become a pattern over the years. Sable spoke to me privately more often than it spoke to anyone else in the human delegation. I was not the most senior, I was not the most diplomatically significant. I think it spoke to me because I was the one who wrote things down, and Sable, whose entire species communicated through harmony and light and sound, understood something about the impulse to record. The council will debate the matter of humanity's formal status for some time, it said. I expected as much, I said. There are factions who consider the incorporation premature, who believe a Tier 1 species, regardless of demonstrated capability, requires a longer observation period before full membership. And other factions. Sable was quiet for a moment. Other factions believe that the traditional classification system requires comprehensive revision, that the categories developed before human contact are no longer adequate. I thought about that. Because of us. Substantially because of you, yes. A conclave administrative being moved past us in the corridor, its presence creating a brief displacement of the slightly pressurized air, and we both paused while it passed. Sable, I said, What actually stopped? The breath. This was the question no one had a clean answer to. The official analysis said the breath had been worn down by cumulative losses and strategic failures, but the breath had sustained losses before. The conclave had been inflicting losses for 3 centuries. Numbers alone did not explain the sudden complete cessation. Saville was very still. The breath is a hive mind, it said. Carefully, it processes all data from all fronts simultaneously. It models every opponent it encounters. The model drives every decision. Without an accurate model, the hive cannot act efficiently. And it could not model us, I said. It could not model you, and it spent considerable resources attempting to do so over the years of human involvement. More resources than it could sustainably allocate. The hive began, in effect, to run too many unresolvable calculations simultaneously. I thought about this. It tried so hard to figure us out that it lost track of everything else. That is a simplified version, Saville said, but not an inaccurate one. We confused it to death. Another pause, to stillness. Saville said, the breath are not dead, they are unresponsive. Whether this is permanent is unknown. I wrote that in my notebook later. Sitting in the human quarters that felt slightly too small and slightly too warm, which was exactly how I liked them. After 4 years in spaces designed for other bodies, the next few months were the strangest I had experienced, and I had experienced a great deal of strange. Earth became, almost overnight, a location that mattered cosmically. Humanity went from a species that did not officially exist in galactic politics to one that had a seat at the largest diplomatic table in the galaxy. The transition was not smooth. It could not have been smooth. 61 civilizations, the youngest of which had 4,000 years more spacefaring history than we did, were not going to simply absorb us as equals without friction. There were conclave species who wanted us quarantined, not hostilely. Scientifically, they proposed that humanity be placed in a kind of diplomatic observation status, welcomed but contained, appreciated from a distance, the way you might appreciate a natural phenomenon that you were not entirely comfortable standing next to. There were species who disagreed, who said that humanity had earned its place, and that earned was the only currency that meant anything. There were species who said nothing at all and simply watched us with the attentive, careful observation of beings who are recalculating something important and do not wish to be interrupted while they do it. Venice published its documentation in the 7th month. It was not a short document. It was, by conclave academic standards, an extraordinarily long one. It covered everything from the initial assessments to the final engagement, and it was built around direct observation, recorded conversations, and the kind of careful, patient analysis that only someone who had spent 4 years doing nothing but watching could produce. I had known it was coming. Venice had been interviewing me on and off for the entirety of the war. I had given it quotes. I had answered its questions. I had read early sections when it asked me to check factual accuracy. But reading the finished document was different. Venice had titled it in its own language, a word that translated to the species that persists without certainty. The document's central argument was this: every species the conclave had encountered fell broadly into one of two categories of motivation for action. Rational actors responded to clear-eyed calculation of probable outcomes. Instinct actors responded to biological programming that had been shaped by evolutionary pressure. Both types were predictable by the breath because both types were at bottom consistent. They did what they were built to do, whether by choice or by nature. Humanity, Venice argued, did neither, or rather we did both simultaneously in ways that canceled out predictability. We calculated and then we did the thing the calculation said was unwise. We felt fear and then we moved toward the source of it. We held rational models of the world and then we threw those models out when they models conflicted with something we refused to abandon, something that was not rational and was not pure instinct, but was something else, something that Venice called, in a translation that it acknowledged was imperfect, the stubborn refusal to accept that the math is final. Humans, Venice wrote, act as though the universe is negotiable. I read that line 3 times. Then I went and found Pete Calloway, who was sitting on a cargo crate outside the docking bay with his small paperback novel, which he was now on his 4th reading of, and I read him the line. He thought about it. Sure, he said, sounds right. Does it bother you? I asked. He looked up at the stars for a moment. We were on the station above the first Human Conclave Joint Research installation. The stars from here were thicker and stranger than they looked from Earth, the arm of the galaxy, visible in a sweep that made every problem feel both enormous and somehow manageable. Bother me that we're weird, he said. No. The universe is weird too, seems fair. He went back to his book. I stood there for a while. I thought about the 4 years. I thought about Keth Avalon Morrieville and the disruption field in the bulkhead. I thought about Osei in the council chamber speaking without triumph, making no claims. I thought about Oakes and his bad coffee and his absolute certainty every single time that moving forward was the answer. Then I went back to my quarters and I opened my notebook. The notebook had been a problem for a while. I had filled it in the first year and transferred to a second one. The second one was nearly done. I had a third one waiting. I opened to the last page I had written on and I wrote the final entry. I wrote, the war is over, we are still here. The universe is not sure what to do with us, which is fine because we are not entirely sure what to do with it either, but we are going to find out. I wrote, Seville asked me once if our people know what we are. I think the honest answer is no, not fully. We do not see ourselves the way the rest of the universe sees us. We do not experience ourselves as strange. We experience ourselves as people trying to do what needs doing, carrying photographs in our pockets and arguing about card games and making bad coffee and moving toward whatever is coming, because standing still is not something we know how to do for long. I wrote, maybe that is enough, maybe that is everything. I put the pen down. Then I put the notebook in my jacket pocket because old habits do not go away just because a war ends, and I went to find Oakes to tell him that the next communication had arrived. It was from a system 3.7 light years out, a different species, a different crisis, a request conveyed in very careful diplomatic language that humanity consider lending its particular capabilities to a new and difficult situation. Oakes read the message. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at me over the rim of his coffee cup. Same coffee on the new assignment, he asked. Probably worse, I said. He nodded. Right, he said, let's go.